is our vice chairman of the Republican Party of Texas. She is a total rock star. She's one of those women that I admire so much because she does not mind wading into battle, doesn't bother her one bit. She does it with, as she says, grit and grace. And she always comes out looking beautiful at the end, because she knows that it's all about relationships and it's all about using kindness. And it's what we talk about all the time. It's we have a better way to lead. And she is the epitome of that type of leadership. And so I am so proud to not only have her as Texas's vice chair, but also to call her my friend. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Kat Parks, and she's going to talk to us about censorship. Oh, and you are muted. You're muted.
1 second, give me a second. There we go. Okay.
Ta-da.
There we go. Can you ladies hear me? Can I get a thumbs up?
Yes.
There we go. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining tonight and talk about an important hot topic. This is interesting that I'm going to be speaking into a camera and have so many of you on the receiving end. And so want to just encourage you that if you have questions or thoughts, please feel free to enter it into the chat. I'm going to try very hard to respond in real time, although maybe as I get through talking about this, I might answer some of those questions already on the forefront. So right now, freedom of speech and censorship. And what does it look like, especially as a conservative? What does it look like as a mother? And what does it look like as a woman, and all these different roles that we have? And I think it's important to distinguish that freedom of speech, I think we're going to separate it into a couple of different groups. So I'm going to spend a little time just providing some information on freedom of speech and how it relates to the Constitution and to the First Amendment, because that's where we get this phrase. And so I want to read something to you that I just came across, and I thought it was some really good contextual information. And it is that the First Amendment, which was considered perhaps the most important of all the essential rights, included both liberty of conscience, so freedom of speech and your ability to express yourself, and also freedom of the press. And it was actually James Madison who drafted the formal amendment to adopt these principles. And it was finally amended, and they decided to put it forward in 1792. And so I'm going to read it to you just so that we all are starting from the same point. And don't worry too much, because I'm not going to make this about a history lesson, but I think it really helps to delve into what freedom of speech is and what it isn't, and how do we deal with free speech today and censorship today as we're facing it. So First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So basically, freedom of speech in that makes it very clear that what we are talking about here is that the First Amendment is talking about the government cannot jail, they can't fine, they can't impose civil liability on people or organizations based on what they say or what they write, except in exceptional circumstances. And we can go over some of those things, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds with you. Although the First Amendment says Congress, the Supreme Court has held since then that speakers are protected against all government agencies and officials, federal, state, local, legislative, executive, or judicial. But what is very important to know aside from that is that the First Amendment does not protect speakers against private individuals or organizations such as private employers, private colleges, or private landowners. So hold on to 1 second. Thank you, Erica. So apparently if I mute my household, I have to ask permission to be unmuted again. So thank you for bearing with me there. So I think that's a really important distinction to make, is that freedom of speech as it pertains to the Constitution, it only has to do with government. Okay. And how we are looking at freedom of speech in a lot of contexts today is it's really broadened. And now the question has turned into, what is government going to do about freedom of speech as it relates largely to our ability to express ourselves on the internet, right? Because that's where many conservatives feel like we're being hampered. We're being hampered in our ability to communicate conservative values. We're being deplatformed from groups like Twitter and Facebook. And so, you know, I do want to make a distinction that the Supreme Court has interpreted speech and the press very broadly, covering not only talking, writing, things that are in print, but they have also included speech that falls under this banner to include broadcasting, to include the internet, and to include other forms of expression. Now, here's the catch-22. Freedom of speech also applies to expressions, symbolic expressions of freedom. So these are things that offhand we may or likely may not agree with. So you can burn crosses. That's covered under freedom of speech. That's not something that we think of. You can burn flags. That's covered as protection under freedom of speech. And so freedom of speech, I think we have to be careful from the conservative perspective, because, and this is where it sort of gets into the separation from legal definition into societal. And that's where we are with culture. And how does freedom of speech separate from culture and with what we're seeing culturally? And I came across a really interesting article, and I thought I would share just a few points with you ladies, because this is really how freedom of speech is affecting us in our conversations, whether it's in college, in a setting with friends, as we're trying to have conversations, you know, with people on social media. If it's trying to understand how we're able to have conversations on social media. And so I want to point out a few things that I think add to the complexity, but are things that we have to acknowledge as we discuss freedom of speech. And so here's a look back to 1965. And some of you were around in 65, and some of you may have been very small, and some of you weren't there yet. But in 1965, culturally, it would have been unthinkable to use the F word on television. Absolutely unthinkable. 40 years later, HBO probably could not exist without use of that word. And so this is where we see a cultural shift, and cultural inhibitions and cultural situations surrounding freedom of speech are really what we start to get into. So when we talk about freedom of speech today, we think frequently of cultural inhibitions. So a person can be embarrassed by what they say, they can be challenged by what they say, they can be cast aside, you know, their job can be threatened. Some of you may have experienced some of these things. And we'll talk a little bit more about what do we do, but the reality is that in terms of freedom of speech as it pertains to the First Amendment, it only addresses the First Amendment when political is invoked to try to terminate competition for cultural expression and the government takes sides. Okay, so what we are seeing right now is there are situations where it certainly feels like the government takes sides. So if we look at higher education, in some ways that higher education is controlling thought and controlling speech, certainly at the university level, but all the way down, you know, into our elementary school being taught. And in reality, the government does have say in those things, because if you look at the money that pays for our universities, it's universities used to be private institutions, but now with government-backed student loans, it's almost indistinguishable with what we have available to us now. So higher education being funded by taxes means that suddenly government is involved with what is or is not being taught. Some of you may remember Berkeley used to be the campus of free speech. I see a few heads nodding. A couple of years ago, there was a speaker, and some of you may have heard about him, named Milo Yiannopoulos. Very avant-garde speaker, spoke to conservative issues, but very gay, very loud about it, very proud about it. And definitely it was the University of California, Berkeley, that he was shut down from doing a speaking event because a mob of angry people came and were breaking windows and setting cars on fire. And the school said, we can't host this event because the reality is that we can't offer sufficient protection. And we started to see this in universities and colleges where the cost of protecting these speakers, and this is a real problem, is groups that were, and you all host many speakers. And so, some speakers are kind enough to speak for free, but some have a speaking fee. What if your cost for security ends up being in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars? And so what it has enabled really the mob to do, or cancel culture to do, is to drive things by destroying property into a way that they make it unaffordable for organizations to speak. And so they use money as a control. Obviously, right now we're in a time with BLM, Black Lives Matter, and we see a lot of riots. We see a lot of those things go on for a variety of reasons in Minneapolis, most recently. But what do they get from those riots? It's not just destruction of property and the attention that comes with it. They are earning themselves a seat at the table for those things. And in many ways, you look at the liability that those business owners have to have. And so they're playing high stakes, not just with the attention and the anger and the mob, truly the mob, but they're playing with high financial stakes. So some of you are maybe remember civil rights and things when, there have certainly been tensions in this country before. I thought it was really interesting. And this is just to give us some frame of reference of Madison, who we talked about, who passed those freedoms in the First Amendment. They saw riots then. And so there were major riots in 1804, 1810, 1811, 1815, 1835 alone. There were 147 political riots in the United States, leading to the death of 63 people. And there were riots that broke out when Abraham Lincoln was running for president. And so I think one thing to remember is that many of us who are millennials or in the younger generation, we've never seen or experienced this before. And maybe we paid attention and found out about these things in history class, but maybe we didn't. Maybe our history class didn't teach those types of things. So talking about what is the solution to free speech issues. And I can share a situation is, first of all, we have to know what free speech is. And I can share a very personal scenario that some of you may have heard about that happened right here in Texas. And I put out a statement to the SRAC and to the press talking about a social media platform called Gab. Are any of you on Gab? Not so many. Okay, not a lot. Well, Gab is a social media platform that markets itself as they allow no censorship. And what is different than Twitter or Facebook on Gab is that you cannot delete comments that people leave on your page. Okay, so normally if someone, how many people in this room have a Facebook account? Okay, lots of Facebookers. I thought it was really interesting. I went to a Texas Republican County Chairman's Association Legislative Day, and I did a survey of the room. And just so y'all have some perspective for any marketing that you might do, almost 195 to 100% of county chairmen have a Facebook account. 5% of them have a Twitter account, and none of them had a Gab account. So this is what we're looking at just in our people who lead our local parties. So Twitter, for those, how many of you are on Twitter here? Okay, a few, not many. So Twitter tends to be a place where your politicos post things, and your, a lot of times your elected officials will post things, and Trump really made Twitter, blow up and be so popular. And I was at an event with Kellyanne Conway, and I thought her take on Trump's tweets was very interesting. She said it was the first time that in America's history that a president could take their message directly to the people. It was the ultimate form of democracy. And so sometimes we agreed with it, sometimes we didn't. It didn't go through 10 filters of a comms team and a check and all these things. It was very transparent, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. But I appreciated it. And so many of our elected officials also use Twitter to share what bills are going through and things that they're working on. I tend to see Twitter as a little more, it's more personalized than, I'm sure y'all probably receive some of the candidate emails that they send out. And some people have a really good, candidate email, and some have an email that it hits your inbox and you delete it right away. I mean, let's just be honest, right? And so Twitter tends to be like, there's a maximum 140 characters. So it's short, it's sweet, and they sort of zing out what they want to send out. But what Twitter and Facebook have in common is, I want you to imagine this and how it relates to you in your life, is if you post something on Facebook, and let's say that you are celebrating a granddaughter or a niece's birthday, okay, or a sister's birthday, and you post, you've done a great job, we love you so much, and we're proud of you. And hopefully you don't have any of these folks among your Facebook friends. But if someone were to post something that were outrageous, hateful, or vile, you can delete that person. You can delete that comment, and it's gone, which is certainly how I run my Facebook page. If somebody posts something that is just ugly, that goes away. I don't feel that I need to create a billboard that would give people access to voice ugly things like that. It's the same when you have a page for maybe one of your TFRW groups, or if you run groups for elected officials. I mean, sometimes people who are even within our party can post something that's not appropriate. Sometimes people who are Democrats will, latch on and try to flood with inappropriate posts. But it's within your control as an organization or someone who started that page to remove those things. Well, interestingly enough, Gab has given the user the ability to hide those things. So if I didn't want to see it, I could hide that ugly comment. But all of you, if you're visiting my page, you could still read it. Okay. So a little bit different here, but a lot of people who left Twitter, who didn't like the fact that they thought they were being perhaps censored, and realistically, many of you may have seen those fact checks that they put up on Facebook. This has really happened in the last 3 years. It's a change, and people don't like those things. And so the Republican Party of Texas added itself to this other social media platform where you can't delete those comments. And unfortunately, we posted some things from the chairman and celebrating Black conservatives throughout our history. And we had many comments, and it's not unusual for the Republican Party of Texas on our Facebook or Twitter account to have hundreds of comments left. And we have staff, we have a social media staff person who deletes things that are inappropriate or ugly. And we had people post some of the most hateful, racist things that I've ever read in my life. And we had no ability to remove those comments. So I made a very public statement and said, you know, we had just joined it in January. In March, after seeing, you know, several months and what this was looking like, and this was not our goal in branding or our goal in trying to reach out and be on this platform, I suggested that we remove ourselves and that we deplatform. And in fact, I took that to the chairman. I took it to the SRAC, and I issued a public statement saying, we have no business. This is not the foot that we want to put forward. This is not about our Republican beliefs or sharing conservatism or opportunity. And it's really conflicts with our message. There were a lot of anti-Semitic comments, things that were truly, truly terrible. And the founder of that platform declared me the #1 enemy of free speech. So he sent out 4 million emails declaring me the #1 enemy of free speech. And so I think this is an important topic on a variety of levels to share with you all, because it's a pretty interesting experience to go through and have 4 million emails sent out telling people that you're against free speech. Not so. Any organization can choose whom they want to associate with. So if you all want to have a TFRW page on Facebook, you can do it. There's no law. There's no law you can. There's no law saying you can't do what you want. Same with other social media platforms. And really the thing that's important for our clubs and our organizations to consider is, do we have the ability to control the message in a way that it's still representing our brand of who we are as Republicans, and that it's still getting out the message that we want to attract others who are like-minded, who believe in freedom and opportunity and personal responsibility, to bring them to the Republican side of things. I can truly tell you, I am a huge, huge supporter of freedom of speech. To me, this was a brand issue because not only did we have these ugly comments coming on to messaging that we were trying to get out that was positive, but we also had people who were identifying themselves as Republicans. Whether they were or not, we don't know if they were, Democrats trying to make Republicans look bad, but identifying themselves as Republicans and posting these vile things. One thing you all should know, I've been a very outspoken person against county chairmen making racist comments. And so I have actually called for the resignation of both Republican county chairmen and of Democrat county chairmen. And these are some of the tough issues that we get into. The interesting thing about being an elected official is even when you wade into some of these issues where we can agree or we don't have to agree, and their freedom of speech is protected. They can and do those things, whether I would like them to or not. And I can and say and respond to them in a way that it starts discourse. And they are difficult conversations sometimes to have. I hope you all have not had to deal with these things among your clubs, but if you have, this is a reality of where we are as a society right now, and the types of things and the types of accountability, and how do you hold people accountable to a standard of professionalism, and as Glennis said, kindness, and having a positive message that will draw people in. And at the same time, how do you walk this line that's so difficult with taking counterculture? And I have some examples here that I can share with you of Black Lives Matters things where, they've rushed into college campuses and they've, taken the stage and they've gotten professors fired. And this is the world that we live in right now. And so how and what do we do? Well, I want to come back to free speech and its definition as we see with the internet and how it's handled by government right now. And so the issue, if any of you have been concerned about being censored on Facebook, is that Facebook is a private business at the end of the day. And there are some thoughts that there are some schools that are trying to treat Facebook as a public square, and trying to say you should be able to say whatever you want. But the reality is that Facebook is protected as a private business to be able to set whatever parameters they have for how they want to choose content. And I don't envy the position that they have with some of their moderators. To have this conversation, honestly, we have to look at, some very ugly things, such as there have been people who've been killed on Facebook that was live streaming. And so no mechanism at the time to shut down things like that have happened initially are what led Facebook to increase restrictions. Now, what we've seen are that conservatives seem to be increasingly censored, although we see studies come out from New York University saying they're not censored any more than liberals are. And so, there are some questions, and there's some difficulty with that. Of course, President Trump was removed from Facebook and removed from Twitter following January 6th. Which I am completely against his removal. And RNC issued a statement actually a couple of days ago. And I'll just share with you some of the things. This was Ronna McDaniel put this out for those of you who didn't see this. And RNC is definitely taking a hard stand and saying that because President Trump was banned from Facebook and Instagram also, he'd been already banned from Twitter. RNC, the Republican National Committee, feels that this is a clear bias that big tech has against conservatives. And so here is the question: is with Facebook and Twitter being multi-billion-dollar corporations headed by some of the richest men in the world, they're not accountable to anyone. They don't have to get votes. They're not accountable to the citizenry, and they don't have to represent America's politically diverse citizenry. So what are we seeing what paths do we have to make sure that we still have a way to communicate? And I don't know what the mix is of those of you who are here, but I think it would be interesting how many of you are from urban areas or suburban areas versus from rural areas. And I'm from a rural county. I'm a former county chairman of a very small county. And sometimes when our statewide politicians or our US senators or US congressmen are talking about reaching outreach to candidates, they talk about what media markets you're in. So what TV bracket do you fall in if you live in a certain area, or what newspaper are you most likely to take? Well, one of the things that I have really started to explain to elected officials is that if you live in a rural area, you probably don't take the Dallas Morning News. You probably don't take the Texas Tribune. And so social media, for those of us who live in rural areas, who might have a newspaper come out once a week, who might only have a newspaper come out once every other week, are some of you nodding? Do some of you live in some of these places? Social media and the internet has provided us with so much connection to the outside world that we didn't have accessible to us before. And so that's one of the reasons that some of the legislation that's recently been passed, for example, making telemedicine available, is so important to those of us in our rural communities, because that internet connection is incredibly valuable for connecting us now, not just to information, but connecting us also to medical treatment. It's the same thing with the legislature passing the rural broadband this session. Y'all, that is tremendous. That is a life changer. That is a game changer. we have got to be able to reach out to those rural communities and allow them to have connectivity so that if nothing else, people who are younger people can work within those communities and work from home in some of those more agrarian communities. And they don't have to move to the urban areas to have the job availability and things like that. So when we're talking about the internet and we're talking about these issues of censorship, it's not only important to all of us, but it's especially important to people who use it as a primary means of communication. And I'll give you another example of what has social media become for us. And that is, how many of you remember having one of those big Rolodexes? Right? I actually bought a vintage one off of eBay the other day. And it's like a monster. It's like Darth Vader sitting on my desk because I get so many business cards. And yeah, we got somebody raising their hand back there. So the Rolodex used to be, see, if we make it, we can make it cool again, y'all. And we might have to, because I'll tell you what, I want you to think about how many people you communicate with now that you just have their information saved in your phone. Okay, so that's replaced the Rolodex for a lot of people. But think of how many Facebook friends that you just communicate with through Facebook. You maybe don't even have their email or their telephone number, right? I have thousands of them. And, I've moved several times and it just became easy. And so it became a substitute for being organized to the extent that, you would have all of those things in place. So that's where this becomes a really important discussion and where potentially the government needs to come in, because we're looking at two major companies that basically have a monopoly over the communication that people have through these social mediums. So I want to pull up a couple of these. Hold on one second. Let me sort through. I thought it was interesting. And I thought this was a really good description of, why don't they do something? Why don't our elected officials do something? Well, there are a couple mechanisms for them to actually do something. Okay. But this is at the federal level. And first of all, I'm going to read this. This was from a Fox News contributor, and I can share that with you all later. But he says the first option is for the government to recognize that these companies constitute clear monopolies in their respective markets, whether it's social networking, mobile content, apps, searching, advertising, and e-commerce. And due to their sheer size, they can exert tyranny over these types of things. How many of you went out to get on Parler? Okay. Some folks got on Parler, and you know what happened? I have a Parler account. I never used it because then, it seemed like nobody else got on it. And then Amazon dumped it. And then iPhones and Samsung removed the apps when they thought that it got associated with QAnon. So once again, we're pulled back into Facebook or pulled back into Twitter. And so, this particular commentator said, in an honest world, the Biden administration initiated action. It's not going to happen because the Biden administration and the Democrats have been huge beneficiaries of tech censorship. So we're not going to see that lead come from Biden. And so it's most likely that if it's going to be addressed, it's going to go to the federal courts and be addressed by the Supreme Court. So Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, actually laid out a very compelling argument, saying that in future cases, the high courts potentially could rein in social media by treating them as common carriers akin to utilities. Okay, so a platform's right to exclude users or censor content would be restricted or halted. And the aim, Clarence Thomas said, the aim is to ensure that speech is not smothered. Then the more glaring concern must perforce be the dominant digital platforms themselves. So he's saying we need to go to Facebook and to Twitter. Given that Biden likely won't act, probably this will have to go through the Supreme Court. The second option is there's a law that was created called the Communications Decency Act in 1996. Y'all remember how much internet there was in 1996 and what it looked like? I can tell you because I was in high school then, and 1996 internet was nothing like what internet is now or the communication that we have. And so I think, like a lot of laws, this was one that well-meaning, it had no idea where things were going to go, just as, you know, most of us in 1996 could never have envisioned. Can you imagine in 1996 that you would have all your computer stuff available to you on your cell phone? We didn't have cell phones yet. In 1996, my mom still had one of those, you know, car phones that was portable, that it looked like a MASH unit phone. You know, it was a giant box that you held up to your head, and that was really right. I love it. There's a comment. I can't even quite grasp it now. That's right. My husband had a conversation with our son Pierce is 7 years old, and Pierce said, Pierce is very political. Many of you may have met him at some of the TFRW events because he loves the TFRW ladies. And he said, what are we going to do about Facebook and social media and all this stuff? Because he's heard our conversations. And John said, Pierce, in 10 years, it's not even going to be a thing. There's going to be something new that we can't even imagine what it's like right now. Think about 10 years ago, you know, Facebook 10 years ago, totally different. So that's one mechanism, Supreme Court. Pierce loves you ladies too. Second mechanism, and that is with this Communications Decency Act of 1996, there's a section in it. It needs to be repealed. It's called Section 230. And in essence, it gives unfettered legal protections to social media companies. True story. So in essence, they're immune from any liability. So you can't sue them. There's no mechanism to get them to stop in censoring material that they deem objectionable. What is objectionable? Well, it depends on who you are right now, especially in today's cultural context, right? So the word objectionable basically allows them to do whatever they want to do without any constraints, and they don't have to answer to anyone. And so the solution, the real solution, and it isn't going to happen because for Section 230 to be repealed, they don't answer to anyone. They should have to be subject to lawsuits and damages over unfair censorship, as well as punitive actions banning users based on politically driven standards. And it's abundantly clear that the Democrat-controlled Congress, they're not going to act to do this because it's in their self-interest to not do it, right? If all of the social media things are protecting Democrats and helping get Democrats elected, you know, what is their incentive to do it? They have none. So Biden's not going to do it as president. We know the Democrat-led Congress is not going to do it. I will tell you what we as Republicans have to do, and that is we have got to have a plan in place to remove that shield from those companies for 2022 when we win back the House. And we have got to win back the House, and we've got to have a plan in place. We've already been in a position we were when Trump got first elected, and the whole nation was surprised, and Republicans weren't ready with a substitute for Obamacare. So we need to be ready because we know this issue is on the forefront, and we need to be ready, and we need to work really hard in this 2022 election to get Republicans elected. And then the third possibility against these tech Goliaths is antitrust litigation. And anything that's just litigation based, what do we know? Yes, and the Senate as well. Yes, we need to break the Senate. Antitrust litigation, it's going to take years. It's going to be time consuming. It's going to cost millions of dollars, and it's not going to move quickly. So a few things that you should know about right now that are going on in the Texas House and the Texas legislature. And one of those is Brian Hughes wrote, and the Senate has passed SB 12. SB 12 is moving to the House, I think tomorrow. And SB 12 attempts to, and I'm gonna pull up this bill so that I make sure and give it complete justice. SB 12 applies specifically to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, among others, and requires the company to disclose their content moderation policies. They don't even have to tell us what their moderation policies are right now. They have to publish regular reports about the content they remove, and they have to create an appeals process for user content that's been taken down. I believe on the House side of things, it's Sanford that worked on a companion bill, and he's a pastor. For those of you who don't know, what got him interested in getting involved in this was that his church tried to do a promotion of Good Friday services, right before Easter, and they were prevented from doing so. So his church was shut down from doing that. I can tell you that there was a huge change. I became a county chairman in 2017. And for the 2018 election, I could buy ads to do political promotion, no problem. And 2020 rolled around and I had to submit a copy of, and I didn't do it. And I want you all to think about if you were in these shoes. What would I want to do? I wanted to share a congressional dinner that we had. It was our fundraiser, our Lincoln Reagan dinner. And I had no problem sharing it in 2018. And when I went to share it in 2019, 2020, they required me to submit a copy of my driver's license and a copy of my social security card to Facebook. Right? So I was not personally comfortable doing that. And so I just didn't. So we were not able to do Facebook promotion of that event. So these things are real. And when you see your county parties who put out those things, more than likely, some poor little executive director has their social security card uploaded online, to do those boosts and those Facebook things. So we will see. And Senator Hughes's bill, in the bill also, the Texas Attorney General would be allowed to file suit against any company that violated a provision of the bill. So Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, the Attorney General, our Attorney General right now is Ken Paxton, could file against them. And if upheld in court, the Attorney General could recoup reasonable attorney's fees and investigative costs. So here's the catch-22. I think it's good. I think it's a good starting point. I really appreciate that Senator Hughes has come through because we know that ultimately what is going to have to happen to fix this is we're going to have to repeal Section 230. And we don't have the Republicans in place to do it right now. And so Senator Hughes has put this in place for us to try. Now, there is some concern from experts that it may not be held. It may not be upheld, that there may be legality questions about it. And certainly there are, think of how much money these tech companies have to bring up these challenges. So we expect that it will be challenged in court, even if it does pass. But I think it's a great start. I have a lot of respect for him, for the work that he's done, pushing this through. And any of you who've been involved in the legislative process probably know that getting legislation through, it's complicated. And a lot of times there are bills that they're not perfect. And I think I heard Glennis say as we started here, that y'all are going to reach out to Steve Toth about the CRT bill and the Senate bill. And man, it'd be better to get some forward progress and some forward motion rather than to lose any good things that we have at all. And so legislation is it's compromise often. So I think Senator Hughes, he worked with a lot of scholars, a lot of constitutional attorneys in putting this together. A tremendous amount of work has gone into it. Is it perfect? Probably not. I mean, probably you'll read things that, could be improved upon at some point, but I think it's a great start and it's something that we have to get this conversation going. I did see that Ron DeSantis, Florida's governor, has pushed through, and I think they mentioned that in the RNC report, that he's recently put through legislation to allow lawsuits up to $100,000. So you're starting to see different states try to come up with a solution to this. And for those of you who aren't familiar with how different states pass legislation, I heard a really great speech from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I think it was Kevin Roberts, and he talked about how states have the ability to influence policy to a point that if enough of them sign on to policy like this, it can create a tipping point that will actually move federal law. And so every single state that addresses this issue sort of puts a ping on the radar of elected officials and lets them know this is important. This is important to our constituents. This is a nationwide issue. And then it starts to bring a lot of people to the table to have those conversations. So those are, I hope I've given y'all a ton of information talking about freedom of speech as it's defined by the Constitution, to what it looks like federally for us to get changes that we know need to happen, even though we're not quite sure what that looks like, to what are we doing in Texas. One other thing I would like to share with y'all, and I'll let you look these up later, but I reached out to Representative Cole Hefner and asked him to share with me just tonight, because even though the topic of this is freedom of speech, I think the First Amendment is very important, and freedom of religion, obviously, was crucial to the founders in coming and creating this country. And so I want to share with you 3 different bills. Actually, one is an amendment, but 2 bills and an amendment that have passed and that I think are wins for Texas that protect religious freedoms. And one is House Bill 525. It was authored by Matt Shaheen. One is House Bill 1239 by Sanford, and then SJR 29 by Jeff Leach. And so those passed, those are going through. They're very positive to protect religious freedoms within the state. And I think I'd be negligent if I didn't mention those things as we're talking about First Amendment and freedom of speech. So I thought I'd see if there are any questions. Y'all please feel free. Oh, all Collin County reps. Oh, there we go. Collin County is representing. Y'all please feel free to filter your questions in the chat. I know we have less than 10 minutes. But I want to share just on a private note, I've been talking with a lot of friends and saying, other than social media, when or what do you know about free speech and why does it matter? And we know it's interesting because it seems that by different age groups and different decades, understanding of free speech and how crucial it is seems to be very different. And my husband is a lot older than I am. He grew up, he went through the 60s and the civil rights issues, the turmoil, the unrest. And it's fascinating for me to talk with him when, as a millennial, I don't have recollection of, I don't know of any of those experiences. And so he talks about freedom of speech. It gives us the power to have conversations to decide what we really think. And I am a huge, I want to have conversations with people. They say there are 2 types of generals in the world. I would say there are 2 types of leaders. And one surrounds himself with yes men, and one surrounds himself with the smartest people they can find. And I want to surround myself with the smartest people that I can find. And I don't want them to agree with every single thing that I, through a conservative free market alternative. Okay, let me read this question. Mary Wise says, is there a possibility to eventually address this problem through a conservative free market alternative to compete with the existing liberal platforms that are so biased? I know this is more complicated than it seems. Mary, that's actually a great question. And that will be one of the primary arguments for these tech giants is they'll say there's nothing stopping anyone from creating something like this right now. And they're right. I have heard that Donald Trump is going to create his own platform. I'm excited to see what that looks like. I think Trump certainly has the access to people and probably the funding to put something together that will have a chance to compete. But I'm a little bit also thinking to myself, I don't want an echo chamber. I don't need to be in a room where everyone agrees with every single thing that I say. Although I'm not one to jump into a lot of Facebook arguments, and even less since I'm vice chair. I am really, and I say this a lot to folks, but I'm an 80-20 Reagan Republican. And fellow Republicans, if we agree on 80% of the issues, you're a friend and an ally and not a 20% traitor. And so I want to have conversations, and I never learn any, I know me personally, I never learn anything by people agreeing with absolutely everything that I think or everything that I say. And so one of the criteria that I value the most in my team members is people who bring different perspectives and who are willing to disagree with me. And so we have to find our way in being able to have discourse, being able to have conversations, and this cancel culture that we have right now. We have got to be able to stand up to people and to say, I don't agree with you, in a respectful way. And sometimes I will say, how many of you have gotten in a Facebook fight with somebody, and a political Facebook fight, and had your mind changed? It doesn't happen. When you fight with somebody, you're just there to prove your point, and you're just there to, bash into heads. But I have had my mind changed on some Facebook things when a friend or someone who I trusted would send me a private message or a private text, or pick up the phone and call me and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this, and this is important to me, and this is why. And so I just want to encourage you ladies, as you're having conversations with friends, with family members, remember that what got Trump elected the first time was a silent majority. But they weren't silent. They were having all sorts of conversations with friends and coworkers in safe places, in safe spaces. And they were saying, what we've got with Obama, it isn't working. Now, they may not have put a yard sign in their lawn, but they went in and they pulled that vote because they received that information from someone, and it was validated. So just keep that in mind as we're also, navigating our own social media presences through all of this, because yelling at people very rarely, either in person or on social media, brings people to our side. And I thought it was Abraham Lincoln, and he had this great quote, and he said, the surest way to get rid of an enemy is to make them a friend. And so that's powerful, and that's true. And you do have to talk with people to first have that possibility of making them a friend. So I think that's probably it, unless y'all have some more questions. Glennis, I'd love to turn it back over to you.
I'm so appreciative, Kat. I mean, I can't even thank you enough, truly. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful information. And I agree with you 110%. I'm sorry I can't disagree with you on anything you said tonight. Another day, perhaps. It is so important that I think that we're not in an echo chamber, that we are open to having conversations with people that disagree with us. I so agree with that. But also, you can't create change if you're not part of the if you're not in the mix. If we all jump out of Facebook, there's no one there to put in any, and I mean, I've looked at my analytics, my messages don't go anywhere anymore because I've been blocked too many times. But
right.
But if we all leave, there's no conservative information being pushed at all. So while I will be the first one to jump on the Trump train, if he does do a platform, I don't think I'll leave Facebook either. I probably won't do a lot, but then I don't do a lot now on Facebook. So there you go. I would like to leave one parting quote. I love this quote, and I'm not even sure where I first saw it, but it's so true when we're talking about. It's really supposed to be about diversity, but it works so well in talking about censorship also, because when you think about it, we're all the same, right? Sure, there's men and women and different cultures and different religions and all of that, but we're all people. We're all made in the image of God. So essentially, we're all the same. So the quote is, "The party of tolerance and diversity cannot tolerate diversity of the mind, because the only true diversity is diversity of thought." And that is true, because the one thing that truly makes us unique from other individuals is what happens in our little brain pans. It's our opinions, our thoughts, the words, how we see the world, our prism. That is what makes us unique. And that's something that, the Democrats try to divide us every way that they can. And they can't tolerate that. That's the one thing they cannot tolerate, a difference of opinion. You have to march in line. You have to be part of the hive mind. And you can see that all the time. That's why members of BLM get so upset if you say all lives matter. I mean, that just doesn't even make any sense, because, well, if Black lives matter, well, all lives matter. Well, Black people are part of all, so it should be okay, but it's not okay because you're not part of the hive. So thank you again. Ladies, just a reminder that this will be posted as soon. Remember, we are a volunteer-driven organization, so sometimes we don't do things as quickly as we would like to, but we are so thankful for our volunteers, and all of our segments for this series and the last series are going, if they're not already, will be posted on the TFRW website in the training video section under the members only area. So you can look at them there. You can watch them to your heart's content. Don't forget, your awards applications are due June 1st. And I think that's all I have for now. So again, until Thursday, we have Tom Giovanetti from IPI, the Institute for Public Stimulation. He's fabulous.
He's good. You guys will really enjoy that.
Yeah, we've had him at our board meetings before, and the ladies loved him. So I'm really excited to have him. And he's going to talk about the economy and why conservative values promote wealth. So we're going to have that on Thursday from 7 to 8, and I will see you all then. Good night.
Good night, everyone.